American Graffiti was not only a critical success, it was a blockbuster, turning out to be the most profitable investment Hollywood had ever made to that point.
At first glance, American Graffiti looks like a simple coming-of-age movie, but it isn't. Behind the music, the fast cars, and one unforgettable summer night is a story filled with near disasters, unlikely decisions, and behind-the-scenes twists that changed Hollywood forever. The movie almost never reached theaters. Several familiar faces were nearly replaced before filming even began, and one unexpected gamble turned a modest film into a cultural phenomenon that reshaped an entire generation of filmmaking. How did a movie that almost slipped through the cracks become one of the most influential films ever made, and which behind-the-scenes stories have remained hidden for decades? Join us as we uncover 15 fascinating facts about American Graffiti that will completely change the way you see this classic, turned down by every major studio in Hollywood. Let's start with the fact that American Graffiti almost didn't exist, and not in the way that studios sometimes flirt with projects before eventually committing to them. This one was repeatedly rejected by people who genuinely could not see what George Lucas was putting in front of them. The whole thing began with a story George felt personally compelled to tell. He had grown up in Modesto, California.
George Walton Lucas Jr. was born to George and Dorothy Lucas, a successful businessman and his wife, in Modesto, California,
a small agricultural town in the San Joaquin Valley that was, in the early 1960s, organized almost entirely around one activity: cruising. Kids would get in their cars on Friday and Saturday nights and drive slowly up and down the main strip, radio blasting, windows down, doing nothing in particular for hours. George had done exactly this through his entire adolescence, and by 1971, that world had vanished so completely that it felt like something worth preserving before it disappeared entirely from memory. He wrote a treatment with married screenwriting duo Gloria Katz and Willard Hike, took it to United Artists, which gave him a $10,000 option payment, and then United Artists passed. The reason was the cost of licensing the enormous soundtrack Lucas was demanding. He wanted at least 40 rock and roll songs, and the rights bill for that alone was going to be significant. United Artists looked at the math and walked. So did almost everyone else. Studio after studio read the script and couldn't visualize the film from it. The concept of a movie with no real plot, set entirely over the course of one night, with 4 different storylines running simultaneously, didn't fit neatly into any category Hollywood understood at the time. Co-producer Gary Kurtz later recalled that almost every studio in town had turned it down before Universal Pictures finally agreed to finance it. And Universal only said yes on one condition: Francis Ford Coppola had to come on board as producer. That condition changed everything. Francis Ford Coppola had just won the Academy Award for Best Picture for The Godfather.
And the winner is Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola for The Godfather.
His name meant Universal could advertise American Graffiti as being from the man who gave you The Godfather, which was the kind of marketing hook that made nervous studio executives breathe easier. The budget was set at a tight $777,000, a number so low that Lucas was essentially being handed a blank creative canvas in exchange for the studio not having to risk much. They didn't expect a hit. They expected a modest return on a modest investment. What they got was something else entirely. Before filming started, Universal also tried to change the title. Executive Ned Tanen thought nobody would know what American Graffiti meant. He worried audiences would assume it was a foreign film or something about art vandalism. He and Francis Ford both lobbied George to rename it. Their suggestions included Another Slow Night in Modesto and Rock Around the Block. Lucas refused both. He held the title so firmly that even after Universal threatened, he simply would not move on it. American Graffiti was what it was called. End of discussion, which turned out to be one of the best decisions George ever made, even if the studio was going to do everything in its power to undermine him before the film ever reached theaters. So what happened once Universal got their hands on the finished cut? The studio tried to kill it after they saw it. Here is where the story gets genuinely wild. American Graffiti was shot in the summer of 1972 across 28 nights in Petaluma and San Rafael, California, with George Lucas shooting 6 to 10 script pages per night at twice the normal pace. The schedule was brutal, and the crew was exhausted. Even George himself was so worn down by the production.
Night after night took its toll on George, and George was often asleep by the time
that he reportedly fell ill repeatedly during filming. The energy that kept everyone going was not enthusiasm for the studio's vision. It was the collective determination of a group of young filmmakers trying to make something real before the money ran out. When they finished, Lucas delivered his cut. On January 28, 1973, 6 months after filming wrapped, he and Francis Ford screened it for a young audience at the North Point Theater in San Francisco, with Universal executive Ned Tanen in attendance. The audience, largely teenagers, went absolutely wild. They laughed, they cheered, they responded to every scene with the kind of spontaneous joy that no studio test screening consultant can manufacture. Ned Tanen watched the same screening and called the film unreleasable. What happened next became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Francis Ford, incandescent with rage at Ned Tanen's response, reportedly turned to him and offered to buy the film on the spot, right there, in the lobby, after the screening, while a delighted teenage audience filed out past them. He would write the check immediately, he said. Just name a price. Ned Tanen didn't take the deal. Instead, Universal told George that they wanted to re-edit the film entirely and hand it to an editor named William Hornbeck. 20th Century Fox heard about the situation and offered to buy the film. Paramount heard about it and made a similar offer. Universal turned all of them down and dug in. They were going to cut this movie whether George liked it or not. What saved it, in a darkly comic twist, was The Godfather winning the Academy Award for Best Picture in March 1973.
Albert S. Ruddy, Godfather.
The moment that award was announced, Francis Ford's leverage over Universal shifted significantly upward. The studio quietly reconsidered its position. Rather than a complete re-edit, they agreed to cut only 3 scenes, around 4 minutes total, from George's cut. One of those lost scenes was a confrontation between Steve and his math teacher that George has cited as among his favorite moments in the film. Universal also insisted on an exact running time of 110 minutes as specified in the original contract, which forced one additional cut entirely because of a song rights issue. George hated every minute of it. He got the film into theaters largely intact, but not entirely, and his experience of watching a studio try to quietly bury something that test audiences were clearly wild about shaped his negotiating approach for every project that came after it, in ways that changed Hollywood permanently. But none of that was visible yet on August 11, 1973, when American Graffiti opened in theaters and the audience arrived. Enormous numbers, and they brought their wallets. So what exactly were they buying tickets to see, and what were they actually watching without knowing it? What the film was really about? On the surface, American Graffiti is a nostalgia trip. 4 high school graduates spend one last summer night in their hometown before 2 of them leave for college. Cars, music, romance, small-town hijinks, fun, light. The poster literally asks, "Where were you in '62?" And the whole package seems designed to make you feel warm about a simpler time. That reading is accurate as far as it goes. Lucas had genuinely loved cruising in Modesto in 1962, and the film is in part a love letter to that experience. But 1962 was not chosen randomly, and the warmth of the film is not quite as simple as it appears. George set the film in August 1962 with surgical precision. Exactly 1 year later, President Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas.
Within 3 years of that night, depicted in the film, young American men were being drafted in large numbers into Vietnam. By 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had both been murdered. By 1973, when American Graffiti was playing in theaters, the Watergate scandal was consuming the presidency, and the country was finishing the most traumatic decade in its modern history. The summer night in 1962 that George was documenting was the last night of American innocence, the last moment before everything that defined the 1960s cracked the country open. The audience watching in 1973 didn't just feel nostalgic for the early 1960s because it was a simpler time. They felt nostalgic for it because they knew everything that was about to happen to the people in those cars, to that country, to that version of American life. And George was counting on that knowledge to give every scene a weight it wouldn't otherwise carry. The ending makes this explicit in the most devastating way. After spending 2 hours with these 4 young men on their perfect summer night, the film cuts to a series of text cards telling us what happened to them afterward. Steve Bolander, the one who decided to stay in his hometown rather than go to college, became an insurance salesman in Modesto. Not exactly the stuff of dreams. Kurt Henderson, who left, became a writer living in Canada, a detail that, for a 1973 audience well aware of draft evasion, landed with resonance. John Milner, the cool, drag racer who seemed most at home in this world, was killed by a drunk driver in December 1964, and Terry the Toad Fields, the nerdy, lovable kid who had the best night of his life getting to drive a cool car and spending time with a beautiful woman, was reported missing in action in Vietnam. And the mysterious blonde? Suzanne Summers in The White Thunderbird, mouthing "I love you" to Kurt at a traffic light while he spends the entire night chasing her? George originally intended to shoot a scene making it explicit that she was a figment of Kurt's imagination, his youth itself, the life he was leaving behind, and the dream of staying that he had to choose to give up. Universal's budget restrictions killed that scene, but the symbolism was always there. She is not a girl. She is an idea. She is everything the summer night represents that Kurt is choosing to walk away from. And the fact that he never catches her, never even gets close, is entirely the point. So the film everyone thought was light and fun was actually sitting in 1973 America and quietly saying, "We lost something, and we cannot get it back, and we didn't even know we were losing it while it was happening," which hits considerably harder than nostalgia. But what about the cast that delivered all of this? Because the lineup on American Graffiti was genuinely something else, and a few of them brought chaos levels the film didn't exactly advertise. So what was actually happening between those actors when the camera stopped rolling? The cast was a chaos factory. American Graffiti assembled what is almost certainly the most consequential ensemble cast in the history of cinema by the measure of what those people went on to do afterward. Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, Harrison Ford, Cindy Williams, Mackenzie Phillips, Candy Clark, Wolfman Jack. The combined resumes of that cast after this film are staggering, and most of them were unknown quantities when George cast them. Harrison Ford was perhaps the most interesting case. He was 30 years old during filming, one of the oldest people on set, had been knocking around Hollywood for years in small roles, and was famously working as a carpenter between acting jobs to pay his rent. George cast him as Bob Falfa, the drag racing antagonist who challenges John Milner.
"Hey, dog, why don't you come on a ride with me in about 10 years? Now leave her out of this. This is just between you and me."
And ends up crashing his car spectacularly. It was not a large role. Harrison was on screen for maybe 15 minutes total, but it was enough for George to clock something in him. And 4 years later, that something became Han Solo and Indiana Jones, and one of the biggest movie careers in the history of the medium. Harrison turned down a pay raise to direct Star Wars in exchange for keeping his merchandise rights. The rest is several $1 billion of history. Richard Dreyfuss beat out roughly 100 other actors for the lead role of Kurt. He was 25 years old, had been bouncing around television guest spots for years, and almost didn't want the part because he thought the character was too similar to people he actually knew. He took it anyway and earned a Golden Globe nomination, which opened the door to Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and The Goodbye Girl, the last of which won him the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1978.
And the winner is a new heavyweight champ, Richard Dreyfuss!
Ron Howard had the opposite problem. He was already famous as Opie Taylor from The Andy Griffith Show, and his child stardom had put him in a strange professional limbo in his late teens, where nobody quite knew how to cast him as a grown-up. He was also briefly alarmed when he heard a rumor that American Graffiti might be a musical, and he told George he couldn't sing. George told him it was not a musical, and Ron could relax. The film's success convinced ABC to greenlight Happy Days, which Ron starred in from 1974 to 1980, which then gave him the industry credibility to transition into directing Apollo 13 and A Beautiful Mind, 2 Academy Awards, 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, in different categories. It's all traceable back to One Night in Modesto. And then there is Mackenzie Phillips, daughter of John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, cast as Carol, the 12-year-old who jumps into John Milner's car uninvited and won't leave. She was actually 12 when they filmed it. Neither she nor her parents were apparently aware that California law required a studio teacher and specific working hour protections for minors on set, which meant the production had been operating without those protections in place. When the studio discovered the situation, the scramble to retroactively get everything in compliance was reportedly frantic. Phillips would go on to star in One Day at a Time before her struggles with addiction became public in devastating fashion, a story she told herself in her memoir High on Arrival, which included allegations about her relationship with her father that shocked the public. But in 1973, she was just a 12-year-old who had snuck into a movie that was about to become a cultural institution. And yet somehow, out of that chaos, every single actor delivered exactly what the film needed, which says something about either George's talent for casting, his talent for directing, or the particular magic that happens when a group of people are too broke and too young to overthink anything. So what happened when it was all over? And how did a $777,000 movie about teenagers cruising in California become the engine that launched the entire Star Wars universe? The film that funded a galaxy far, far away, American Graffiti, was made for $777,000. It grossed approximately $55 million in its initial 1973 release, was re-released in 1978 and added another $63 million, and went on to earn over $140 million in total worldwide box office. When home video, licensing, and the certified triple platinum soundtrack are factored in, total revenue exceeded $200 million on an investment of less than $1 million. The return on investment was approximately 180 times the production budget based on box office alone. It became one of the most profitable films in cinema history by the measure of what it cost versus what it returned. Lucas earned nearly $4 million from his profit points on the film, a number that, given the $150,000 he had earned as director, represented an extraordinary windfall that arrived while he was already deep into writing the script for his next project, a space opera called Star Wars. The timing of American Graffiti's success was critical. Lucas had been developing the Star Wars concept since 1971 and had been shopping it around with limited enthusiasm from studios. Science fiction was not a prestige genre in the early 1970s. It was B-movies and low budgets and nobody's first-look deal. But when American Graffiti opened in August 1973 and immediately became a phenomenon, Lucas's standing in Hollywood shifted overnight. Alan Ladd Jr. at 20th Century Fox, who had already been intrigued by the American Graffiti concept and admired Lucas's commercial instincts, greenlit Star Wars in 1973, just months after Graffiti hit theaters. Universal's first-look deal on Lucas's next projects had actually given them early access to Star Wars. They passed. Fox took it. What Lucas negotiated for Star Wars, taking a lower directing fee in exchange for retaining the merchandising rights and sequel rights, was a strategy he could only have executed from a position of financial security. The American Graffiti money gave him that security. It meant he didn't have to accept whatever Fox offered just to keep the lights on. He could trade salary for ownership, which turned out to be the most consequential deal in entertainment history. The merchandising rights to Star Wars alone have generated billions. None of it happens without American Graffiti first making Lucas financially independent. The film also, through its success with an audience starved for something warm and uncomplicated in the middle of Watergate and Vietnam, kick-started a 1950s nostalgia wave that reshaped American popular culture for the rest of the decade. Happy Days premiered in January 1974, 4 months after Graffiti opened. Laverne and Shirley followed. Grease was on Broadway and heading to film. a film made in 28 nights in 1972 by exhausted young filmmakers on a budget so tight that Lucas couldn't even include the scene that would have explained his most important visual symbol, deemed significant enough to preserve for the nation. And the cast, people who were young, unknown, and occasionally setting fire to hotel rooms and getting thrown into swimming pools during production. Where are they now? The people that made it special. Graffiti, in its oldest sense, is writing on walls. It is the impulse to mark a surface with proof that you were there, to leave a record of a presence before it disappears. Ancient Romans scratched it into the walls of Pompeii. Teenagers scratched it into school desks. It is fundamentally an act of preservation against forgetting, an insistence that this moment, this person, this life existed and mattered, even if nobody officially wrote it down. American Graffiti is George Lucas scratching his generation onto a wall before the record could fade entirely. The cruising culture he was documenting was already gone by the time he made the film. The innocence of 1962 was already a decade in the past. The young men who had spent those summer nights driving around listening to Wolfman Jack were already somewhere in their late 20s, some of them veterans, some of them carrying the decade's losses in ways that were not visible in 1972 and were barely speakable yet. He was not making a nostalgia film. He was making the record those lives deserved. The Wolfman Jack connection underlines this perfectly. The real Wolfman Jack, Robert Weston Smith, born in Brooklyn, a DJ who had built his identity and his career on Mexican border radio stations that broadcast into California with enormous power, was already a mythological figure in George's memory of those nights. He had thought about making a documentary about him at USC Film School. When American Graffiti made George a millionaire, he paid Wolfman Jack an additional fee on top of his acting payment for having been the inspiration for the film's sonic world. The voice that had tied those nights together had to be in the movie, because the movie was the memory, and you can't preserve the memory without the voice. Wolfman Jack died in 1995 at 57 from a heart attack.
Legendary rock and roll disc jockey Wolfman Jack died yesterday of a heart attack.
Bo Hopkins, who played the Pharaoh's gang leader, died in 2022 at 84. Suzanne Summers, the mysterious blonde in The White Thunderbird, died in October 2023 at 76, one day before her 77th birthday. The cast that was so young and vital and messy during those 28 summer nights has been thinning year by year, the way all casts eventually do. But the film is in the National Film Registry. The moment is preserved. The wall has writing on it. That is what American Graffiti was really hiding. It was never a party. It was a funeral for a world that had already gone, thrown by someone young enough to still feel the loss acutely, and skilled enough to make everyone else feel it too.
How many other films did studios kill in that same era that actually were as good as they thought American Graffiti wasn't?
And does it hit differently now, knowing that every warm, fun moment in that movie is George Lucas quietly grieving something he knew was already gone? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.